Welcome to Insiders Access, Equity, and the Future of Education. Here's our host, Head of Editorial Special Projects, Julia Hood.
Hi, I'm Julia Hood, and I'm excited to host our event today. Our educational system is in the middle of a revolution and an evolution. The global pandemic has moved the classroom to the home for students from kindergarten to graduate school. But the move to hybrid learning has exposed gaps in access to technology or reliable networks for students to do their schoolwork. At the same time, student loans have taken a huge toll on an entire generation and put pressure on colleges and universities to prove their value. The moment is ripe for disruption in education. Enterprise companies are accelerating new platforms, while students and educators alike are asking, how can we do this better? Today at Insider, we're convening an important conversation on access, equity, and the future of education. Please share today's message on social media by using the hashtag Future of Education. And now, let me introduce the first session. The Future of Education is our keynote presentation. What does the future hold for U.S. higher education? In this session, Scott Galloway, author, entrepreneur, podcaster, and professor of marketing at NYU Stern, breaks down the transition of American colleges from the great equalizer to playgrounds for the elite. Scott unpacks the reasons behind the skyrocketing tuition, the logic of exclusive admissions, discusses his proprietary framework for evaluating college value, and presents a path forward to better and expanded educational access. Thank you, Scott, for joining us.
My name is Scott Galloway. I teach at NYU, and I appreciate your time today. We're going to be spending some time talking about what the future of higher education might look like. So we're going to cover a few things. Specifically, we're going to cover the notion of that education, other than maybe healthcare, is more ripe for disruption than any $100 billion plus industry in the U.S. The primary fist of stone coming for the mother of all chins is COVID-19, which is really more of an accelerant than a change agent. We'll talk a little bit about what we think the future of higher ed might look like and what the silver lining is, and then some recommendations on sort of what we can do to realize that silver lining. So ripe for disruption. Peter Drucker said demographics are destiny. And simply put, there's just going to be fewer consumers. We are headed towards what might be a little bit of a birth dearth in the U.S., and there'll just likely be fewer people, college age kids in the nation applying to colleges. As a result, we're seeing a decline enrollments. Four-year institutions are up, but two-year institutions are down substantially, which has pulled the total enrollment for institutions down 4% this year and 8% last year. However, it's hard to argue that a college degree isn't really still the American dream. If you think about it, only about somewhere, depending on how you categorize higher education, somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 people have some form of certification from a higher ed institution. Yet if you look across the most influential people in our economy, in media, in politics, the number of people who have a college degree is just overwhelming. And one could argue that what has been traditionally the upward lubricant of the middle class has become the caste system in the United States. And that is, whereas in Europe, the caste system was based on your last name, in the US, it's based on whether or not you go to college and specifically where you went to college. The lifetime employment and earnings of someone who went to college are dramatically more than people with less certification. It is an industry that we have a stranglehold on. There's been a few universities who consistently pop into the top 20 of global rankings, but weapons, media, software, and education, America still has an incredible lead. And even the kind of, if you will, the coal or the fuel of a lot of innovation is in fact universities. If you were to show me a company that's added more than $10 billion in stakeholder value over the last 12 months, typically it's within not just a drive of a world-class engineering university, it's within a bike ride. Universities are the groundswells, the epicenters for where innovation begins in our digital economy. They have been traditionally a fantastic way of upward mobility. And what's interesting is if you want to talk about the schools that are fulfilling their mission, and I would argue the mission of higher education is not to take the 1% and turn them into billionaires, but give the other 99% a chance of becoming the 1%. And universities still do a pretty good job of that. So some of the Cal State schools and some of the junior colleges, or what you would call less prestigious schools, do an especially good job of that. I was really kind of blown away. I teach in New York at NYU. Cornell is a good university. Columbia is an average university. Fordham, an average university. But Pace is not considered a prestige university. And yet, if you look at the metrics, over 55% of the students in the bottom quintile that go to Pace end up in the top quintile. And that is really, if you think about it, Pace is more than any school in New York registering against its mission or fulfilling its mission. I always like to give a shout out. I think that universities are about the unremarkables. This is me, my junior year in college. I like to put this up because it's obvious I haven't changed at all. But in addition, to just talk about how much things have changed. And back then, the admittance rate was actually somewhere between 42 and 60%. And now the admissions rate is 12%, meaning that it's gotten somewhere between 4 and 5 times as difficult to get into UCLA. And as a result, they're not able to take chances on unremarkable children of single immigrant mothers who lived and died. Secretary, yours truly. Also, just in terms of value, a lot of the surplus value, the societal value added by higher ed, has been starched out by universities themselves. If you look at the starting salary of an MBA from the class of 1992, when I graduated from business school, the average starting salary was $100,000. The tuition was $4,000, yielding a ratio of 25x. Now, the average salary has increased to $140,000, but the tuition is $100,000, yielding a multiple of 1.4. So if you will, the multiple of salary on tuition has gone from 25x to 1.4x. Let's talk a little bit about purchasing power. Again, the starting salary was $100,000. The average house in the Bay Area cost $280,000, $140,000 now, but $1.4 million. So the cost, your salary, or the cost of a home, was 2.8x times your salary. Now it's 10x. In sum, the benefits relative to the purchasing power have substantially eroded. In addition, this really is a caste system. The top 1%, or kids from the top 1%, are 77 times more likely to get into an elite university than kids from the other 99%. And we see that while we continue to let in what I'd call freakishly remarkable kids from the middle and lower income households to kind of rub Vaseline over what is a caste system, it's primarily the elite universities have become littered with two cohorts: the children of rich people, and again, these freakishly remarkable kids. So I would argue that at least at the elite level, we have lost the script. We're no longer see ourselves in the agency of others. We're no longer public servants, but luxury goods who are drunk on exclusivity and brag about turning away 80, then 85, then 90% of applicants, which is tantamount to a director of a housing shelter bragging that 90% of the people who turned up last night we turned away. I think higher ed has absolutely lost the script. It needs to go back to the notion or recognition that we're public servants, not luxury brands. This is an industry that is probably more ripe to be disrupted than any industry, maybe with the exception of healthcare. Now, how do you determine if an industry is ripe for disruption? It's simple. You look at how fast you have raised prices relative to inflation. And if there's a big gap, if you have not filled that gap with incredible innovation, you're sticking your chin out. A 1990 Mercedes S-Class on an inflation-adjusted basis is less expensive now, 30 years later, than it was in 1990. And the car is substantially better. On an inflation-adjusted basis, education is much more expensive. And other than the fashion and what they would be drinking or eating in class and maybe overheads instead of PowerPoint, if you walked into a university class right now, you wouldn't be able to tell it wasn't 1990. The only thing that's changed is the compensation of administrators, of faculty, and tuition. So there's a link here. And that is, I believe that almost every decision that administrators and tenured faculty make in higher education is with one aim, and that is to reduce their accountability and to increase their compensation under the notion of some sort of nobility or self-aggrandizement or arrogance. And the result is a transfer of wealth of about $1.6 trillion from middle-class households to the administration and tenured faculty and endowments of universities. I think it's morally corrupt, and I think the reckoning is on its way. Even with aid, university or college education has skyrocketed in costs. Spring used to be a nervous but joyous time where you would find out where your kids were going to college. Now it has become a season of despair, where a lot of families have to sit down with their daughter who's done what she was supposed to do, been a good citizen, done exceptionally well in school, and have a conversation that says, either one, we can't afford to send you to school or the school you want, or two, place that family under huge financial strain. We're talking about mortgaging houses. We're talking about kids coming out with so much debt that they form households later. They get married later. They're much more risk averse around starting businesses because they enter into adulthood with what is this unbelievable anchor around their necks called student debt. COVID-19, to a certain extent, has pulled back the curtain on the game or the roost that is higher education. And that is when you take a university all online, effectively what you have is a streaming video platform that has certification at the end of it. So to use a kind of a snarky analogy, Harvard is now a $50,000 streaming video platform. Granted, it's great networking with the other people watching that streaming video platform, and it's a great certification. But just to give you some context, at the end of the day, streaming video platforms are intellectual property and content streamed through media that you absorb and hopefully get some sort of benefit from. And this is, if you will, really highlighted or shined a very ugly, bright light on the hair and warts that is higher education. One could argue that this is the best time, if we were able to travel, to go abroad, because other universities have managed to deliver this same sort of certification and education. You could argue the certification isn't as strong because U.S. schools really have become luxury items through a mix of scarcity and also outstanding execution. But nobody gets away with the prices that we charge our young people and families like the U.S. We're also seeing universities becoming more and more vulnerable, and that is they're becoming increasingly dependent upon tuition, just as some media companies that are increasingly dependent upon advertising are more vulnerable. Universities have a great business model on the way up, and that is they have very high fixed costs, specifically salaries that tend to be immovable objects, and the maintenance on buildings and infrastructure, and then very high margin units or really strong unit economics. Specifically, every kid that takes or signs up for a class at NYU, we get about 90 plus points of gross margin. It's a great business on the way up because incremental revenues all flow to the bottom line. It's a terrible business on the way down, and that is the universities that are going to see a decline in enrollment don't need to lose 30 or 40% of their businesses to become financially strained. They just need to lose 10 to 15 because they lose so many gross margin dollars that they go from being profitable to unprofitable pretty quickly. We've also seen an incredible erosion in state support, and that is at best you could describe it as flat. That federal revenue increase is mostly through guaranteed student loans, but in some, it seems as if states and governments have fallen out of love with higher education. I would argue that some of this is our fault, that in higher ed, we're very open and very tolerant, if you will, of people who don't look like us, but we're increasingly intolerant of people who don't think like us. And that is, loosely speaking, America is roughly divided down the middle between Democrats and Republicans, but that is not the case on university campuses. It skews exceptionally blue, almost kind of incandescent blue. And what you see across some universities, and the best example of Harvard, is only 1.5% of Harvard faculty identify or self-identify as conservative. And I believe that when state legislatures are, loosely speaking, 50% Republican, they're not in a hurry to increase the funding for an institution that they believe is promoting values that are oftentimes in opposition to theirs. So universities, like every other institution, have been somewhat politicized. And I think it's hurt us. I think it's made it more difficult to find or get the support of the Commonwealth, if you will. In addition, universities have adopted, they're like anybody else. They want nice homes. They want nice jobs. They have found a way to massively increase their own compensation, specifically administrators. So while there's been a 62% increase in staff and student enrollment, we've figured out a way to quadruple the number of administrators, quote unquote, these what I will call almost non-accountable jobs. They would argue that they are very accountable and these are difficult jobs, but there's just no getting around it. The correlation between increases in salary and increases in administrative costs are directly related. We've seen a massive increase in the cost per full-time employee, the administrative costs that translate, again, to that massive transfer of wealth from middle-class households to universities and administrators and tenured faculty. One example is the 90 to 95% of the highest paid civil servants in Massachusetts all work for one employer, the University of Massachusetts, where you have several people, and this information is dated, who make upwards of over $1 million if you include benefits. Meanwhile, enrollments haven't increased. The benefit of that degree hasn't increased, but they have managed to increase their salaries faster than inflation. So the outcomes haven't increased in quality. The two things that have increased are salaries for these administrators and two, the tuition. There is a link here. The average salary of a professor at UMass is $161,000. And then if you look at the principal, we're not talking about a professor who's in a leadership position. We're just talking about a teacher who does research. And then you look at a principal and you think about the work and credentialing and experience and excellence someone has to demonstrate to be a professor, or excuse me, a principal in a full-time school. And you can start to see how the compensation is incredibly, has been incredibly flush, if you will, among higher ed. They're also great places to work in terms of benefits, which translates again to exceptional costs for students in middle-class families. We've seen salaries increase dramatically, but not as fast as tuition. What we haven't seen increase are enrollments. So again, enrollments aren't increasing, but salaries and tuition are increasing. There's been sort of a Rolexification of universities. My university, UCLA, undergrad, and then Berkeley grad, were kind of almost jokes in terms of how, or we used to make jokes about how bad the facilities were. But at the same time, the tuition per quarter at UCLA was $400. At Berkeley per semester was $1,000. So granted, while we didn't have water parks, what we had was the ability to pay our tuition, get a great education, a great certification, without encumbering our futures with a lot of debt. So what do we have here? What do we have? We have companies or firms, specifically the Ivy League, that are more spectacle than they are historic, and that is they really don't have that much impact on America. If you look at the total enrollment of the Ivy League, it's about the equivalent of Ohio State and FSU. 150,000 kids, there's something like 10 or 11 million that get educated at our public universities. So while we talk a lot about the Ivy League, it's really finishing school for the children of rich kids, and also, as I said, some remarkable kids, and they're happy with their exclusivity, and they'll likely double down on that. So that's not going to move the needle in terms of well-being for the Commonwealth. Any programs that really change what it means to be in America are probably going to be programs focused on our land-grant public universities that, again, educate the majority of our students. And what we see across the Ivy League is that while applications have continued to rise, they want to actually constrain the number of admits and increase the scarcity, this luxury model. The head of Harvard admissions said that he could have doubled his freshman class without sacrificing any quality. And the question, or the logical next question is, well, with a $40 billion endowment, why would you? Stanford has trebled its applicants over the last 30 years, but hasn't increased its freshman seats, resulting in incredibly in institutions that are just harder and harder to get into. And while the alumni like that because they think that their certificate is going up in value, what it effectively means is that your son or daughter isn't getting into the school you went to. And we all joke that, oh, I could never get into my school now if I had to apply. Well, guess what? Your kid has to apply, and he or she probably isn't getting in. We see stagnant growth in enrollment. I would argue there are some exceptions. I believe that my host institution, the University of California, hasn't totally lost the script. They are trying to increase their enrollment faster, and they are increasing their enrollment faster than most universities. They do see their role as public servants to increase the number of kids who have access to the incredible opportunities that many of us had back in the 80s and 90s. Still, we've seen enrollments. Granted, they're up over the last 20 years. They're up 31%. But we've seen the admissions rates absolutely plummet, and we've seen the costs skyrocket. So in sum, harder to get into and more expensive, and we haven't kept pace with demand. And people create this or make this bullshit argument. I've done some advising at the University of California that what would that do for our brand? Well, The admissions rates were much greater when I went to school, but the brand was strong enough for me to get a job at Morgan Stanley and then gain admittance to another great graduate school. So I think it's a hollow argument that the brand equity of these organizations would decline if they doubled or even tripled the admittance rates. The problems persist across different states. In Massachusetts, you've seen enrollments up 29%, admissions rates decline, and again, incredible increases in tuition. So where are we? Just as it is across a number of sectors, I think COVID-19 is more of an accelerant than it is a change agent. It's literally pulling the future forward. You could take the 2 or 3 biggest trends in every industry and take the slope and take the curve out 10 years, and that's likely where they are now. I think this is a really interesting exercise to do in any business and say, is our consumer where it was supposed to be in 10 years? Is the market where it was supposed to be in 5 years? And then think about your capital allocation, your strategy. Does it foot to that acceleration? I think it's also an interesting thing to do personally. But we've had essentially years happening in weeks. Lenin has this great quote that sometimes nothing can happen in decades, and then in weeks you can have decades happen. And I think we're in that latter stage. This is the chart that best sort of embodies or encapsulates the theme, and that is, loosely speaking, since 2000, every year, the percentage of retail transacted through digital channels has increased 1 point. And as we stood here in 2020 in March, approximately 18% of retail was transacted through digital channels. Within 8 weeks, it jumped to 28%, meaning we had a decade of increase in e-commerce penetration in just 2 months. We've also had the same thing happen across different sectors. We've had 6 years of acceleration in grocery in just 1 year. Online grocery was increasing, but it increased 6 years in just 1. The percentage of people working from home, and this can't be a surprise, accelerated a decade in just 2 weeks, and we're probably not going back. I think there's a lot of consensual hallucination among owners of commercial real estate that people can't wait to get back to the office. It's hard to imagine that you're not going to see demand destruction of at least 20 or 30% across one of the biggest asset classes in America. I think one of the tectonic shifts in our economy is going to be the redistribution of capital, effort, and time from commercial real estate into residential real estate. What does that mean? It means sell any office REIT and buy restoration hardware or Pulte homes or any remote technology. This is happening across all sorts of societal trends. More and more young adults were moving in with their parents. Why? Because for the first time in our history, a 30-year-old is not doing as well as his parents or her parents were at the age of 30. This is especially strong among young men, but again, it has accelerated dramatically. And now, get this, more young adults between the ages of 18 and 30 are living with their parents than are living on their own. We've also seen huge shifts in online learning. The searches for different types of online learning offerings have skyrocketed as, again, we're seeing a dispersion away from the university. Think about healthcare as a metaphor. About 99% of the people who have contracted, endured, and developed the antibodies for the novel coronavirus will not have entered a doctor's office, much less a hospital. So we could have $3 to $4 trillion of spending dispersed away from the normal channels of distribution, doctors' offices and hospitals, and into the home. I had somebody come to my house today and stick a swab in my nose. I'm going to have or can have prescriptions delivered to my house now within 2 hours, or perhaps speak to a pharmacist using the PillPack Amazon Prime service 24/7. The same thing is happening in education. And that is, I used to do 1 or 2 classes remotely just to test the technology. Now I'm doing all 12. There's been a dispersion of the value in the delivery, no longer running through the nozzle or the filter, and quite frankly, the constraining supply of a campus. That is going to create tremendous opportunity. It's also going to create tremendous chaos. If you look at freshman enrollment in 2020, it has plummeted. A 13% decline in enrollment in an industry with high fixed costs and very high gross margins is financially incredibly straining. This isn't a 13% decline in revenues, it's 150% or 100% decline in EBITDA or surplus. Private schools pushed in person. Why? Why did private schools want or so badly feel they needed to have some sort of in-person experience? Simply put, I think they are more financially vulnerable and they charge higher fees and their value ratio is out of whack. And that is the only way they can support their, what I feel are, usurious, immoral tuition is to offer some sort of on-campus experience. So just a kind of a symbol of the arrogance here, or how cushy things have gotten on universities. This is what the president of Chapman describes as brutal cost cuts that they are forced to take. Also, when we talk about the endowments here and their need, they're not in need. At least the elite universities aren't in need. So what did I do? I decided to try and figure out what is the difference between a university that's going to thrive. I believe similar to what's happening across every industry, where the strong are getting stronger. Once there's a culling of the elephants, the surviving elephants have more foliage to feed off of. Who will be okay? Who is really going to struggle, and who will likely go away? And tried to create a metric. I have never received the type of pushback I have received from publishing this index. I've said very provocative things about big tech. I've said very aggressive things around board of directors, powerful people, powerful companies. Nothing like if you were to question the value proposition of universities or question the salaries of administrators. So how did we go about doing this? We looked at value, and that is, we said, okay, let's look at the value of the credential, because to be honest, education or higher ed, we're not in the business of educating as much as we're in the business of credentialing. Our primary value proposition is to act as a giant HR department that puts in place incredible screening, whether it's ensuring you don't have a DUI, that you're mentally strong, that you can work well with others, that you test well, that you have the right pedigree. And in exchange for that certification and then forcing you to get through certain hurdles over 4 or 5 years, the largest corporations in America will pay a big premium for that certification. So we're in the business of certification. So school rank, the admittance rate, and also how strong the brand is, as evidenced by search volume, and we looked at the search volume across every university to determine that, is really the primary value driver, if you will, in higher ed. We then looked at the experience as ranked by a survey service called Niche. And then we looked at the actual increase in your salary registered post this certification as opposed to pre, and how much money they spend per student. This is in some ways a damaging metric to look at, because one could argue that that punishes companies that employ technology to reach scale. So we might change that. I'm trying to figure out how to adjust this to better reflect not only who survives, but who is probably adding societal value. But unfortunately, who survives and who's adding societal value may not be totally correlated. Then, so we have our numerator, if you will, value, and then we divide it over tuition to come up with the value. Then we also looked at vulnerability, and we decided that the two primary levers or comorbidities here, where if you had a small endowment, if you have a $40 billion endowment, you could shut Harvard down for 3, 4, 5 years and be just fine. If your revenues go down 10%, you'd be just fine. A lot of universities, and the majority of universities, have very, very small endowments. We hear a lot about these endowments, but once you get outside the top 100, endowments plummet. So a low endowment is obviously a comorbidity. And then in this instance, the percentage of international students you have. We brag that 25% of the students at our universities are international, and that we do it for diversity. That's bullshit. We do it because they're cash cows. They pay full freight. About 400,000 university employees owe their livings to, and this, I believe it's about a $4 billion infusion of cash from international students. They may and are likely to substantially go away. A mix of xenophobia, racism, difficulty around visas, and obviously a nation that has 5% of the population, but 20% of the infections and deaths, isn't exactly a welcome mat. If you stayed in a hotel and you were paying full price, but the general manager was a racist and the hotel was riddled with COVID, you might decide that that's not probably the best hotel to stay at. So the more international students, the more vulnerable, the lower the endowment, the more susceptible. So let's look at some universities. University, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, great school, very high rank, incredibly strong brand equity, very low admissions rate, very prestigious university, fantastic experience for the students, and also incredible bump in salary. You just make more money once you come out of UNC than you would have otherwise. And then a tuition that is very reasonable. So we have a fantastic product at a low price. This is a company, also a very strong endowment, very low international students. I think UNC has prioritized in-state students, which I think is what a state school is supposed to do. So this essentially UNC Chapel Hill is pretty much bulletproof. They're going to be fine. They will probably consolidate when some of these tier 2 and tier 3 universities go out of business. They'll have greater number of applications. They will consolidate. They will get stronger. Now, the ones that survive, Purdue, a decent ranking, 57th, very strong experience, and an education that increases substantially, or a decent education that increases their earnings power, not a ton, but a good amount, and also a very reasonable tuition. Much lower endowment and a little bit vulnerability, or more vulnerability, 2 times the median of international students. So a little bit more vulnerable than more schools, but a very high or very strong value proposition. Strong value, but decent comorbidities. So we put that in, if you will, survive. Now, struggle, and that is low value, low vulnerability. And that is, these are companies that don't offer a ton of value, but will probably have staying power. Not in the top 100, a very low experience. Students coming out of here just didn't love going to college there. A decent bump, but not a huge bump in salary, actually lower than the median, and about an average tuition. So not great value here. And also, but what probably keeps them in business? Pretty strong endowment per student, and not vulnerable in terms of, or about average number of international students. And then let's talk about a college that we think could potentially just go away. So Sarah Lawrence, which shocked me because it's got a good brand name. It's got a very strong rank, and also decent search volume, a little below the median, a very high admit rate, which probably hurts its prestige, is not considered a great place to go to school, not a great experience, and also doesn't add a lot of value in terms of economic bump. And then we're seeing it's expensive. So what do we have here? We have a college that has a decent product, has sort of a Hyundai or Volkswagen-like product, but is charging Mercedes-like prices, and is also quite vulnerable. And that is, it has 2.5 times the number of international students. It could lose a lot of cash flow if international students decline, and its endowment is average. So this is the kind of company we think is actually quite vulnerable. So I published this and made it an open source working document where you could download the document itself. I invited suggestions on how we could make it better, and suggested that people use it as a working document to catalyze a conversation around their own strategy and their own capital allocation. We had about 100,000 reads in the first 48 hours, tens of thousands of clicks, and more comments on the post than I've ever received on any post. Also, I don't think I've received a cease and desist letter in 10 years, much less maybe ever. And then within a week, I received 3 cease and desist letters from universities that were in the parish category. And I did talk to one of the chancellors, and he said, look, you're not helping. We're in an exceptionally challenging time, and to label us as parish makes parents and students more insecure about coming to college or even sending in their tuition checks. And I thought that was a fair criticism. So we got rid of the word parish, and we changed to struggle, because who knows if these colleges go away. Ian Bagost, I think that's his name, from Georgia Tech, wrote a fantastic article in The Atlantic talking about just how culturally strong many of these institutions are and how loyal their alumni are. And it got me thinking that there might be more barriers of exit, if you will, or there might be more moats that keep these organizations in business. But nonetheless, it evoked a very emotional reaction. And even from some fairly famous academics who took it quite personally and demanded apologies. So I would suggest that the interim chancellor, who makes $1 million a year, should not hold her breath waiting for an apology. We also took many of the comments, and some of them were great comments, very seriously, and we updated, and anyone's free to go to the site, profgalloway.com, and download the worksheet. But we added a lot more colleges. A lot of people the biggest comment was, why isn't my school on there? We also updated the search volume to round out. So for example, included search terms to better capture if people were searching for the institution. And then we updated the percentage of international students, because a lot of people reached out and said our numbers were wrong. And then we, again, changed the nomenclature from parish to challenge because we don't want to be part of the problem, if you will. We also made about another 24 changes and continue to make them. So I want this to be a catalyst for conversation. I think this survey or this data set is wrong, but I would argue it's less wrong than anything that's ever been published. It just strikes me how few data-driven analyses there are of institutions' survivability. And this is a former dean of learning and engagement at Baylor University wrote up in a journal his view of the study. If I sound defensive, I am a little bit. So here we go. So we're going to have volume decline, right? In 2021, we're going to see more and more pressure placed on the same on these institutions, and we're going to have fewer and fewer people, resulting in a substantial decrease just in tuition. The thing that's not reflected here that is really where a lot of universities are getting killed is things like dorm fees or meal fees. In addition to losing the revenue, they've actually had to increase their costs because rather than using a crisis as an opportunity to reduce their costs across their faculty and their facilities, they've increased their costs. Supposedly Purdue purchased over a mile of plexiglass. And to their credit, a lot of universities have implemented very strong testing measures, but all of this has been very expensive. So they haven't reduced costs, but they've increased costs, not haven't reduced them. So they have a decline in revenues and an increase in costs, which is obviously a pretty ugly cocktail. And again, the number of students from outside our borders who tend to be full payers and pay the highest price are declining. So our revenue mix or our margin mix is getting worse, if you will. And again, I think the overall trend here that we can take away from COVID across the biggest shifts in our economy are what I would call again, this incredible dispersion. And it's taking place at universities. We're going to see the campus no longer be the filter through which all value has to run through. So where does this all head? The current model is unsustainable. I teach on Tuesday nights 280 kids, as I'm doing here now, via Zoom, and they each pay $7,000 or about $1.96 million to listen to me do this for 2 hours and 40 minutes for 12 nights. Now, granted, they get a certification, they get units that build towards a certification, and it's still worth it. The certification of the Stern MBA from NYU is still an ROI positive experience. It increases their earnings potential and their currency in the market substantially. However, I would argue for the long term, this model is just not sustainable. So think about this, $1.96 million, $163,000 per night. I tried to find another product that has these types of margins. So think about this. This is probably 97 or 98 points of gross margin on a $2 million price tag. The only product I could find that has those unit economics is a rare disease knockout pharmaceutical drug that just came on the market last year that cost $2.1 million and is basically a life-saving drug against a rare disease that results in such severe muscular atrophy that you die. So there's a drug that saves your life, and then there's brand strategy. Those are the only products I could find that can garner a multi-million-dollar price tag at 90-plus points of margin. I don't think what we're doing at universities is sustainable. I think it's morally corrupt. I don't think that we should be in the business of affecting that kind of revenue transfer or wealth transfer from young people to universities. I started an online education company called Section 4. And effectively, what we're trying to do is take 50% of the value add of an elite elective or an elective from an elite university, do the principles, do the constructs in a condensed format, 2 to 3 weeks. We call it a sprint. It's an intense format. Take a lot of the rote learning and put it in video modules, do 3 live streams, have TA office hours, an intense environment, networking via Zoom and Slack, and try and conservatively bring 50 to 70% of the value of an elective from an elite university, but offer it at 10% of the price, such that you charge $700 or $800 instead of $7,000. And I think that value proposition is very powerful, as evidenced by the fact that our classes so far are getting enrollments of 1,000 people plus. They get shut off at 1,000 or closed at 1,000 people. So you can see that this opportunity in education is dramatic, that there's so much cloud cover, there's so much margin to be attacked here that it's going to attract a ton of new entrants. I also want to point out that I think it's important not to conflate what's happening in higher education with schools. I think a sophomore at Tulane that has to stay at home and can't return to campus is a meaningful disappointment. It's a nuisance, but a 9-year-old who can't go to school is a tragedy. I don't think the two are the same conversation. I don't think that I've been a huge advocate for closing universities, but I think that there is a very good argument that we need to have a national priority on keeping K through 12 open. But the conversation just is different. There probably is no cohort that is better prepared to survive the pandemic or being forced to stay home than a 19-year-old in college, as many of them are from middle and upper income households. They can take care of themselves. They will likely get the majority of their college experience. And there's nothing I think more tragic or one of the most tragic things than a young boy or girl that can't attend school. I know personally that when my 9-year-old wasn't able to attend school last spring, it was a huge stress on the household and on him personally. Anyways, I don't think the two are, I just don't think anything I'm saying about higher ed, I think it's a different conversation through K through 12. It strikes me as just insane and evidence of how fucked up in the head our response has been to this novel coronavirus, that we have figured out a way to save restaurants and keep restaurants open, but we haven't figured out a way to keep open schools. How do you know if your school's going to be open or not? It's pretty simple. It's a matter of resources. And for some reason, we've decided that small businesses are America, but that our schools are somewhat expendable. The result here is just dramatic. We're seeing essentially what might be a lost generation, and that is low-income kids largely track with middle and upper-income kids in-person learning or in-person learning. But when it comes to remote learning, they're falling off the map, whether it's they don't have broadband, mom has to go to work and can't sit next to them to ensure they're getting their learning done, or they don't have sufficient technology. But this is just, in addition to it being morally wrong, we're going to lose half our scientists, we're going to lose half our leaders, we're going to lose half our half the people that move our society forward or put in a position to move our society forward are not going to be capable of this. We're losing a generation. We're also seeing incredible childcare burden, obviously shift to the woman, and let's be honest, it's almost the woman. And then we have this, what I call this hollow or kind of fake wrapping yourself in this national and the flag around the importance of keeping universities open. And I think a lot of this was just Latin for parents, please send in your tuition checks. I argued that it was a mistake to reopen universities, that if you looked at the universities or the communities where more than 10% of the population came from were students, and this is a study done by the New York Times, they registered their greatest outbreak soon after the students returned. I don't think this was worth the risk. And in addition, to pretend that we're offering any sort of similar experience, it's just not true. What we've done is we've invited most of the kids back to the city where the school is so they can learn from their dorm room remotely, such that, quite frankly, we just had more of an excuse to claim it was a reasonable facsimile of the product so we could charge the same price. At my host institution, they actually decided to increase tuition 3%, which I would describe as the mother of all tone-deaf decisions. I want to be clear, though, because the data, we get it wrong all the time. And I think that I have to acknowledge, or we need to acknowledge, that a lot of universities, the data is in, have done a fantastic job of managing the virus. And that is through a mix of technology, distancing, protocols. They have some of the lowest positivity rates of any organizations in the world. And some of these schools are literally finding that they are almost able to eliminate, and you can never eliminate, but get close, really suppress the virus. There have been terrible outbreaks on other campuses where within a week of returning, they had to close them. But I just don't think there's any arguing that some of these universities have served as role models for how you can manage this virus. So anyways, credit's due, or credit credit where credit is due, so to speak. Also seeing real inspiration here. Tremendously low positivity rates. Why? Because they're smart, they test and trace, and they leverage technology. Now, what do we have here? These universities are obviously going to be fine. And again, going back to the notion of what is more corrupt here, someone charging $1.96 million for 12 sessions of this, or giving somebody a life-saving gene therapy for $2.1 million. I just don't think these two are equivalent, and I think it highlights just how much we have lost the script in higher education. So as you can tell, I'm a bit of a glass half empty kind of guy. So what is the silver lining? And I would argue that the silver lining here is as big as the cloud. And that is, there's a huge opportunity. A crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And I think we'll really regret not taking advantage of this crisis and leveraging technology, both small and big tech, to dramatically increase enrollments and dramatically decrease costs. And that is the average size of an online class obviously scales really well. And people talk about, well, if you dramatically increase the campus enrollments and go remote, or that you decrease the real benefit of college, and that is the college experience. And I would argue that it's not an either or. That if you take 50% of your classes online, and the dirty secret of what we do in academia is if you're elegant about it and smart about it and leverage technologies to bring in more speakers than you otherwise might. I've had Andrew Yang, Mark Benny. I've had people I otherwise couldn't get because of this remote technology. You can take advantage. There are some things that increase the quality of the class. But say you take half your classes online and you do it well and you invest in the right technologies and the production values, the reality is you can probably maintain the same level of experience, the same educational experience. And the leadership and the interpersonal growth scales really well. Kids will find a way to have their hearts broken and recover. Kids will find a way to determine grits. Kids will find a way to find mates or non-mates. Kids will find a way for self-exploration around curiosity and who they are. That scales really well on its own. What we need is more scale around the actual delivery of the education that has been purposefully restrained to create the illusion of scarcity that supports above market price increases. So through a mix of online learning that increases enrollment and supply and also decreases costs, this is just a more efficient way to deliver learning. We ideally could substantially increase admittance rates while decreasing costs. That's where we want to go here. And it's not anything different. It's really back to the future. And that is, we need to figure out a way to take a quarter to half of our classes online. We need ideally to get an increase in budget to substantially increase the technology we adopt, and then massively, massively increase enrollment. That's where we need to head here. And I'd like to think there's an opportunity for a grand bargain with our states and public funders to say, well, if we decrease the cost per student 30 to 50%, would you be willing to increase our budgets 10 to 20%? I think that's the opportunity. I think universities should be subject to the same cost pressure as middle-class households and businesses. But if they can, through cost cutting and through a mix of online or an embrace of online courses in big and small tech, what if we could substantially decrease the cost of delivery per student? I think it is very difficult to decrease gross costs because some of these costs are largely immovable objects. But what if you could double the enrollment and increase costs by 30 to 50% instead of doubling the costs, if you will? Even doubling the admittance rates only takes us back 6 years. That is how incredibly difficult it has become to get into world-class universities. And again, I don't think the role of great universities is to take the 1% and make them billionaires, which is what I would argue we have set this construct up for. But it's to give the other 99% a shot at being in the 1%. There are other opportunities here. We could arbitrage two-year universities or junior colleges which have the capability to deliver learning at a much lower cost and mix the lower cost two-year universities with the 2 years of finishing at a world-class or a more prestigious school. Now, granted, you lose a lot of the leadership and interpersonal opportunities there. You could also see, again, a tremendous arbitrage. There's also huge innovation coming into the space. So if it's a $2.5 billion business everywhere, is there a way to find one outstanding instructor, one outstanding set of production values, maybe some TAs to have 2 or 3 to have office hours or some in person, but basically take the cost from $2,500 to $500 And I think there's opportunities to do that across a variety of subjects. But universities have purposely put up artificial barriers to ensure that they capture all that surplus margin. And again, continue this transfer of wealth from middle-class households to campuses and endowments. So next steps or recommendations. I think generally in the world of academia, we have to return to this notion that we're public servants, not luxury brands. We have to dramatically reduce costs. The administrative bloat, higher ed should be subject to the same scrutiny and same discipline as every business and middle-class household has had to endure through the novel coronavirus. My biggest fear is that the crisis isn't deep enough to provide deans and leadership at university with the cloud cover they need to make really substantial structural change. I also think we need to incorporate small and big tech to dramatically increase enrollment while decreasing cost per student, such that we can move back to where college should be, and that is as the premier upward lubricant of the middle class that has ever been registered across any economy, as opposed to a caste system that attempts to take wealthy kids and freakishly remarkable kids and turn them into billionaires. We need to fall back in love with the unremarkables and give kids who are good the opportunity to have great futures vis-a-vis this wonderful thing called higher education. So what do we have here? Ideally, higher ed should be a lubricant to the caste system, not something that reinforces it. I do believe we've lost the script around this and need to dramatically rethink higher ed's role in our society. Disruption is coming. The fist of stone of COVID-19 is coming for us. It's become obvious that we've raised prices way too fast and that there probably is going to be and should be other on-ramps into the American dream other than a four-year degree and this general notion that you failed as a parent if you don't get your kid to a four-year college. In sum, we've been preying on the hopes and dreams of middle-class families for way too long. I do think there's a huge silver lining here, that this crisis could catalyze a set of investments, a rethinking of how we approach higher education, and hopefully, we can get to a point where we dramatically decrease costs, dramatically increase admittance rates, such that we can go back to where we were in my generation and start falling back in love with the unremarkables and give good kids great opportunities. This is my book, Post-Corona, From Crisis to Opportunity. I talk about three primary sectors, the markets, education, and society, and how I think they're going to change in a post-pandemic world. Again, my name is Scott Galloway. I teach at NYU, and I appreciate your time today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Scott, for your insights. Our next session looks at a different angle on inclusion in education. Many of you already know the Special Olympics as a celebrated and much-loved sports organization that gives people with intellectual and physical disabilities an opportunity to compete around the world. But for the past 2 decades, Special Olympics has also been at the forefront of education innovation through its Unified Champion Schools program. Its goal is to promote social and academic inclusion through sports and leadership activities within schools. But its impact extends beyond the classroom, as student participants take an inclusive mindset with them throughout their lives. To talk about the Unified Schools program, I'm delighted to welcome Tim Shriver, Chairman of Special Olympics, and 2 alumni U.S. Youth Ambassadors, Taja Ilaran and Maya Garrett. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Tim, it would be great if you could start by telling us how the Unified Champion School program works and what are you focused on right now?
Well, listen, I think we're all noticing around the country, and I dare say around the world, that there's a lot of tension in our culture. There's a lot of pandemics. There's the pandemic of the disease, but there's also a pandemic of division, of fear of difference. We're becoming closer and closer together as a planet, I would almost say, and more afraid of each other. In that environment, we believe, the Special Olympics movement believes, that people with intellectual differences, people who come at the world from a slightly different perspective, have a lot to teach the rest of us. And it is in that spirit that we launched some 2 decades ago the idea that Special Olympics belonged in school as a place where we could learn to play together in Special Olympics unified sports. So we hope that every school in America someday soon will have let's say a men's basketball team and a women's basketball team and a Special Olympics unified sports basketball team, playing interscholastic sports and competing for school spirit, for trophies, for wins and losses, for the honor of representing one's school. We hope that honor will accrue to all people in schools, not just to the elite athletes, through Special Olympics unified sports. But we also, in Unified Champion Schools, invite young people to be the leaders themselves. This isn't a program where it's all boxed up in a curriculum, where it's distributed from the ivory tower universities down to the people. This is a program where we invite young people themselves, 10, 12, 14, 16-year-olds, to say, I want to create a school that is inclusive and welcoming of difference. So we invite young people to lead together inclusively, children with intellectual disabilities leading alongside their non-disabled peers. And we invite the young people to try to change the school culture and climate, get rid of bullying, get rid of humiliating speech, get rid of patronizing discussions and demonization of others. And what we found is when we get kids playing together, leading together, and changing the school culture together, it's not expensive. It's extremely effective, not just in changing the culture of the school to reduce things like bullying, but also in improving people's happiness, people's attention to schoolwork, people's the likelihood that children will learn more effectively. All that goes up. So we're very excited about the Special Olympics move to schools, the Unified Champion Schools movement, as responding to the urgent issue of our time, which is how do we educate our young people to grow up so that they choose to include when given the chance.
So that's about the future as well, beyond school. So you've written, and I know you've done studies on something called the inclusive mindset. Can you tell us a bit about that? How is that born in schools and fostered throughout your life?
Yeah. Well, it's surprising in a way. We've studied so many things in psychology and education about how we want kids to be more academically competent, stronger in science and technology and electronics and mathematics and social studies and civics and language arts. We haven't studied, ironically, what it takes to educate people to be inclusive, to be welcoming, to be non-discriminating. Such a huge issue in the world. How do we teach people across age-old barriers not to discriminate, not to scapegoat others that are different? So we set out a few years ago to try to study what are the components of young people who have what I'm calling an inclusive mindset. It's a new term. You're hearing it here in some ways for the first time publicly. We found 4 qualities that compose, we think, this mindset. The first is these young people have developed empathy. They feel what other children feel. Secondly, they've developed perspective taking, which is they can place themselves in another child's position. They can think through the implications of being in a different place, in a different role, of being on the outside in this case. The third thing these young people have is what I'm calling moral courage. They're willing to risk their own standing in a group in order to include someone who's outside the group. This is very important, especially for teenagers, where belonging to the group is really important. Those with inclusive mindsets want to belong, but they're willing to take a chance for someone who's left out. Very, very important. The fourth quality, we believe, is what we're calling universalist values. These children grow up believing everybody counts equally. They're not shaken when they see some children doing better in school and others not doing as well. They're not shaken by the crowd when some people gravitate towards the celebrity type person. They see everyone as having a right to dignity. So those 4 qualities, empathy, perspective taking, moral courage, and a belief in the universal dignity and equality of others, when you put those 4 together, we believe you start to create the mindset that you can keep with you, right? It's not just in the moment. This is what we call generalizable. You can take it into work, you can take it into life, into family, into civic responsibility. And I think, we hope, that as we learn more about how to educate people to have inclusive mindsets, We will educate generations upon generations who will not be bound by the old prejudices and old animosities and old injustices that have had their way for too long in the United States and in other countries around the world.
Really interesting. And it's four very actionable and kind of understandable pieces of the puzzle there. So what do you think is going on generationally? Is there a shift in this generation in terms of inclusivity? Is that going along with cultural change generally, do you think?
Well, there's so many things that are promising about this generation. There's the first generation raised with the internet, where the access to other cultures, other people is part of their childhood. It's the first generation that is really seeing the possibility of not being bound by old categories. There's a lot of things that this generation is always labeled for. They're too eccentric, they're too egotistical, they're lazy, all these other kinds of things you hear. But we're very bullish in our work. In the Special Olympics movement, we see a generation which is no longer willing to tolerate the exclusion and the demonizing of people who are different. It's a beautiful thing to see young people, 12 and 14, 16, 18, 20 years old, who have it in their own heart to be unwilling to accept the exclusion of some children over others. They're just not willing to buy the story that some groups are better than others. So we see this as a generation that not only is prepared to launch what we call an inclusion revolution, but actually demands it. They're not willing to work in places that are discriminatory, that are oppressive, that are sexist, that are racist. They're not willing to shop for products of companies that aren't open and inclusive. They don't want to live in communities that stigmatize people who are different. They certainly don't want to go to schools that treat some children as as people of lesser value. So we think there's a big tailwind around inclusion. You wouldn't know it by watching the news. You'd think everything is going downhill, but we actually think there is a strong trend in the culture among young people towards a more inclusive future. And we believe, humbly, that our athletes, now these are people who most people think I need to help them. We actually believe they're the secret professors. They're the teachers. They've often lived exclusion. They've lived being excluded. But our athletes, the athletes of Special Olympics, know what it means to take a chance again on inclusion, to run their race, to play the game, to be on the team, to be brave in the attempt, and to stay open. And those are the gifts that if we allow them to teach the rest of us, the Special Olympics movement goes from being a movement for people with intellectual differences and all of a sudden becomes a movement from them, a gift to the rest of the culture about how to live more fully alive.
That's really inspiring, actually. A very positive message for times which are somewhat complicated and challenging. So tell us briefly, what's on the roadmap for the Unified Champion Schools program? What's coming up next for you?
Well, listen, we think of ourselves, and this is really important for, I know you have some parents who watch, I know a lot of business leaders are part of your audience. We believe it is so important that every system in the culture model and work towards inclusion. It is not that hard. We can do this. Let's not be defeated by all the naysayers in the press who say we're hopeless about our division. Let's not be defeated by the naysayers who say, well, this is an age-old pattern, we can't change it. That's not true. We can teach empathy. We can teach perspective taking. We can model moral courage and universal values. These are things that can be taught and modeled in our businesses. Our vision is that someday every school in the United States, now, this is a big vision, audacious, you might say, crazy, but our movement's crazy. We believe in the impossible. We believe that someday every Parks and Rec department and every school in the United States will have a Special Olympics unified sports program right alongside every other one. And when that happens, that generation will grow up and they'll see the guy who's 6'2" or 6'4", who's going to a Division I college to play basketball as a school hero, and the young woman who's 5'9" and who's able to dunk at the rim, maybe as a school hero, and they'll see the athlete with Down syndrome, who might be 4'11" and a half, and they'll see him as a hero or her as a hero too, an icon of bravery, of courage, of the values that make this country, and I dare say every country, great, because it's what's inside that young athlete that all of his or her peers will see and realize that they are in the presence of a great human being, someone around whose values and whose dreams and whose qualities we should all be modeling ourselves. And the age of pity and condescension and exclusion will end because we will educate people in a whole new way to value all the gifts in the human family, not just those precious few that we value today.
Thank you for that. And now I'd like to invite Taja Illerant and Maya Garrett to talk to us about their experience with the programs. Taja and Maya, you had both decided to become U.S. Youth Ambassadors. Can you tell us what prompted you to do that and what your experience was like? Let's start with Maya.
So before I was a youth ambassador, I was only involved in Special Olympics in Illinois. And I had attended a couple of youth activation summits in Illinois. And in these summits, I learned more about leadership and Special Olympics and unified sports and just how to bring inclusion back to my school and my community. And with this experience, I knew I wanted to be a youth ambassador so I could share my experience to all of the other ambassadors and also hear their story and where they come from. And we also just share ideas that we can bring back to our states. And it means so much to me because I can advocate for individuals with intellectual disabilities.
That's fantastic. Taja, tell us about your experience as a U.S. Youth Ambassador.
Okay, so this is how it happened. So we had got the application. They had asked us, and I was reading the description because I like to read things before I get into it. So I started reading the description. I was like, ooh, this fits me. Because I love meeting people. I love meeting new people and getting to learn their stories. So when I applied and I heard, and then I found out that I actually got the spot, I was really excited because I was like, yay, I get to share my story. And I also get to learn my fellow U.S. Youth Ambassador stories. So I can say that I really did enjoy being a U.S. Youth Ambassador. It was just great.
And do you think that people who are going through, individuals who are participating in the Unified Schools program and in Special Olympics more broadly, what impact does that have on their lives in the long term? And what impact is it having on your lives to have done what you've done?
I definitely think that Special Olympics has a lasting impact on people's lives because I can look at myself as an example because before Special Olympics came into my life, I wanted to be a doctor, and that's not the plan anymore. After I had all of this experience, I realized that I wanted to be a special education teacher because I saw the impact that teachers had on students at my school, and I wanted to do the same for other students in my future. And so now I am a freshman in college at Illinois State University studying special education. So that's how.
That's so cool.
Maya, you can still be a doctor because you could be like me. You just keep going back to school over and over again. You get to be a doctor of education instead of a doctor of medicine. It's kind of like not the
good plan.
Taja, how about you? How has it changed your life and your perspectives, and how have you seen it change other people's lives?
Okay, so I got first I'd like to share a story about my sister, how it changed her life because she has an intellectual disability. So I have a sister named Katrina Jackson. She has an intellectual disability also. Going through the Unified Champion Schools made a huge impact on her. My sister, she's a bus attendant for our district, and she meets new people every day. She is super excited about going to work. Being at work, she just loves it because she gets to interact with people that she usually does not interact with. So I can say that on our family, it has made a positive impact, especially with me because I was down in a dump before and I really didn't have a light to shine. But when I joined the Unified Champion School program, it just made a huge impact in my life too.
That's fantastic.
I just hope the business leaders just heard what Taja just said about her sister. Loves to go to work, can't wait to show up, does the job, does it well, is a this is the story that, we're dealing with 70, some people would say 80% unemployment. 80%, not 80% unemployment in people with intellectual challenges. And yet you hear the stories over and over again. This is a community that wants to work, that's ready to go to work. And as Taja says, just give them a chance. Just give people a chance. I mean, it's an age-old human story. Just give people a chance. That's what Taja says. I mean, it's heartbreaking to hear you say that, Taja, that you were down in the dumps. And I've heard you say this before, and it's inspiring to people, but it's also heartbreaking and in some ways almost infuriating that you'd spend so much time never finding your place, never finding anyone who would listen to you, welcome you, value you. And I'm thrilled that our movement was able to change that. But everybody needs to be on this same team of welcome, of inclusion, of opening the doors of opportunity. That's all our community asks for, is a chance. That's it, just a chance. And this is an era in which we have to do better. We have to do better at giving people a chance.
Well, to that point, Maya and Taja, do you agree with Tim that your generation, the younger generation in our country right now, won't accept what may have been a non-inclusive mindset in the past, that your generation will make real change happen around the world?
I do think that I was able to see that in my high school. In 2019, my high school became a national unified champion school, and I saw that change the climate of my school completely. It was just a much more inclusive place to be with individuals with intellectual disabilities, and I loved it.
Taja, what do you think about young people today? Do you think that young people today will make changes that previous generations have not been able to in terms of being inclusive?
Okay, so I believe that our generation, we talk about the things that we want to do, but we just don't sit around and talk about it. We make sure that the things get done because we want to see that change. We don't want to be sitting here coming up with the plans and coming up with the ideals. Why come up with the plans and ideals if you're not going to do anything but sit around and still look at the same thing that's going on? If you're about the change, then that's what needs to happen. You need to do the change. Mm-hmm. And I believe that's what our generation is about. Just being about being those change makers.
And that really is a great segue to kind of a question that I'd like everyone to answer, which is really, how do you see what does inclusive mean to you? What is the change that you would like to see in schools and in the communities that support schools to be more inclusive? What does that really mean for people? Maya, would you like to start?
Sure. I think inclusion means just accepting everyone, no matter where they come from, and making relationships with people with no preconceived notions. And I think it just means showing the love that you have for people and always being genuine. And I love that I've been able to make so many friends, and especially Taja, because I know we'll be friends for forever. And I hope in my future, after I graduate college, I see other high schools and other middle schools become national unified champion schools like mine, so that when I'm a teacher, inclusion isn't something that we need to advocate for. It's just something that's already implemented into school systems.
Taja, how about you? What's the change that you would like to see in the future?
The change that I would like to see in the future for inclusion is us not be about that talk, but actually take the action of moving forward, of actually getting these schools to be national schools, getting these schools to be more inclusive. I believe once we start in a school, then the communities will see how impactful inclusion is and how everyone and every person needs to start accepting people for who they are. Like for me, I know acceptance was hard for me. I know it was difficult. I know I wasn't accepted everywhere I went. But as soon as I joined the Unified Champion Schools, I was accepted. And I feel like if young adults and kids with intellectual disabilities get that opportunity to feel accepted and be accepted, then that's a major change in the world already.
Thank you, Tim. How do those running companies, running schools, running other institutions make this happen for our Maya and Taja and all of this, all of our communities?
I wish I could say anything even close to as brilliant as Maya and Taja have just said it. To share the love in our hearts, to move from thought to action, to move. These are, it's inspiring to listen, Maya and Taja, to you both. But I just want to also point out, this is urgent. This is not just some charity. Okay? We've just elected a new president, whether you're Republican or Democrat. The new president's challenge to the country is to unite, to restore our soul, to build back better. And I'm not saying this as a Democrat or as a partisan. I'm just saying those are words for all of us. Unite our country, build a stronger, more empathic, more open soul, and build back a country where we can remove the inequalities, remove the health disparities, remove the prejudices in our systems, the racisms, the sexisms, all these things. Let's take these on. We can do this. And we don't have to limit the capacity of the future of this country. Let's look to our teachers. What does a great teacher do? They look at 10, 20, 30 children in front of them of all abilities, colors, races, religions, and they say, my mission is to get the best out of each of you. Now that's worthy of every company in America. Look at the employees that you can bring into your company and find a way to get the best out of them. Look at all the diversity of people who are hungry for work and get the best out of them. It's the same thing in politics. It's the same thing in education. Schools can be the front lines of an effort to build a new, more just, more peaceful, more unified United States of America. We have this in our name, United States, but maybe in some ways we've never been the United States. Not yet. Taja, Maya are showing us that we could actually become the United States, where we let the love in our hearts shine and we get about the action of building communities where every gift is valued. No matter the gift, it's valued. We've got a place for you, all of you, everyone, no exceptions.
It's been a great conversation and inspiring, but also a call to action. And I really appreciate all of you for coming and sharing your passion for this. I think we're going to be teaching a lot of people a new way to think about education. And I really appreciate all of you taking part. Taja, Maya, and Tim, thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
I want to take this moment to remind our audiences of the official event hashtag Future of Education. Please help us spread the word about these important conversations around the future of education, its challenges and opportunities. We also invite you to take the attendee survey at any time during the event. Just click on the survey icon at the bottom of the page. And now another great conversation. Business Insider senior tech reporter Payal Zafiri is talking to Dreambox Learning President and CEO Jessie Woolley-Wilson about tech innovation and access.
So thanks, Julia. My name is Payal Zaveri. I'm a senior tech reporter at Business Insider, where I cover cloud software and enterprise technology. And today I'm going to be speaking with Jessie Woolley-Wilson, who is the president and CEO of Dreambox Learning, which is an online math learning platform for students who are in kindergarten through 8th grade. Jessie, thanks so much for being with us today.
Very happy to be here.
So I think, we know that all students are learning remotely right now, using more technology. Walk me through, for people who aren't familiar, what has changed for students this year and for the way they're learning, and, how has it changed who's involved in their learning process?
When the COVID pandemic hit, everybody's life changed overnight. People who thought they were ready for blended learning discovered that 100% virtual was a different thing than using technology in classrooms. So schools closed, districts closed, parents started working from home, those that were fortunate enough to have that as an option. And overnight, parents became the primary learning guardian. And maybe it wasn't a parent, it could have been an older sibling, It could be an aunt, an uncle, somebody in the home. So overnight, teachers yielded to home-based learning guardians. A class of 25 students that was in one space went to balkanized spaces as each kid reverted to their home. And we all had to reimagine learning, both in the classroom and outside the classroom, overnight with the aid of technology. Again, if you're lucky to have it.
So, how is technology helping students, teachers, and parents or, learning guardians get through that change?
So there are different experiences. So I think for schools and districts who had made investments in preparing their teachers to leverage online learning tools like Dreambox Learning, they might have been in a different stage of readiness because they had devices and perhaps they had access to broadband, both in the school and in most of the homes of the families that they served. But for a lot of other schools and districts, they didn't yet move over to blended learning. And they might be in places, perhaps rural districts, where access to the internet is spotty at best. And they might be in districts where they don't yet have handheld devices to support distance learning. And maybe these districts were hoping that the devices they had available to them in schools would be enough to help them leverage online learning technologies. But when schools closed and districts closed, then access to both devices and broadband became harder for many students and teachers and families.
So a lot of these things you're mentioning are, inequities that students and teachers and parents already faced before the pandemic hit. How has all of this kind of been exacerbated by the pandemic and by this shift to online remote learning?
The good is that many of the things that were happening before became more accelerated. So the dependence on distance learning and online learning tools has increased. So many schools and teachers who thought that it was a nice to have woke up overnight in March and realized it was a must have. So I don't think we're going to go back to how things were. On the other end, there were schools that weren't ready. They didn't have the devices and they didn't have broadband access. And so the gap between the haves and the have-nots is starting to expand. A couple of other considerations took place in the spring. The first is that many schools had to cancel their spring assessments. And schools and districts use that to get a sense of how kids are doing in math, in reading, etc. So they have these summative assessments, these tests, that give district administrators and teachers a sense of where students are in their learning path and how likely they are to end the year on track. And all districts and schools canceled them last spring, and it's very likely that they'll have to cancel them again this spring because of the recent surge in the pandemic. On the good side, to the extent that students have access to tools like Dreambox Learning that are engaging, that are personalized, and that are efficacious, many students were in a position to actually continue to learn effectively, to gain understanding of mathematics or reading or whatever they were using, and are not losing ground as much as some of their counterparts are. So both are happening. Some things are improving very well for some groups of kids, and some things are getting harder for other groups of kids in different communities.
When you talk about, access to broadband and access to internet, and, having access to the devices that students need to learn, what needs to change more broadly in society and in the education system to kind of make sure that, all students have access to those things since it's becoming so essential?
So we had a hard decision to make at Dreambox in March because we knew that we were in many schools, but maybe not all schools in a given district. So maybe a district has 50 schools and maybe Dreambox is in 10 of them. But what we did know about those districts is that the districts were in a state of readiness for blended learning because we were in at least 10 of those 50 schools. So we had a choice. We could continue to take care of our existing customers and do the best that we could to help them through the typhoon, and it was a typhoon, or we could open up the platform for free so that those other 40 schools in that district, even though they were not paying customers of Dreambox, could have access to the best personalized, engaging, and online learning, in our case, in mathematics, available. So we decided to open up the platform. We didn't know what was going to happen, but in 8 weeks, we added over 2 million kids. 2 million kids. So that made us feel good, because that meant that 2 million kids who otherwise would not have had the support of Dreambox Learning to help them learn math while they're at school now had it, even though they didn't pay for it. And it was a gamble for us, because there was no guarantee that when the pandemic receded, that they would stay with us. But given that parents were under siege, and district administrators were under siege, and teachers or learning guardians were under siege, we said, if we could just help them with one thing, which is to know that their math instruction was going to be able to continue, that would be a good thing, even if it didn't benefit everybody across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So we did that. We added 2 million kids to the system. And we're very happy to say that even though school ended in June, most of them the vast majority of them have stayed with us. So what do I learn from this? What I learned is that kids and families are probably more ready for online learning support than we thought before the pandemic. Those that have access to broadband and access to devices are probably in a very good position to continue to take advantage of the benefits of online learning, even when school resumes, face-to-face school resumes. On the other hand, the other side of the coin, there are students and families in rural settings, or students and families that are in less advantaged settings, economically less advantaged settings, where they don't have persistent and consistent access to devices or broadband. So imagine a family with a mom and a father. Not all families are like that. And imagine that each of them are working from home. Not every family has that privilege either. So they each have a computer and they have some kind of broadband. But let's say they have 3 kids in that home, and those 3 kids have to use online learning all day long, consistently, in order to not fall behind. So how do those parents decide? Do I work from home and use my computer, or do I give my computer to one of my 3 children? So even though there's a check mark that says that home has access to devices and broadband, it's not consistent and it's not persistent for children. So even though that's a privileged home in many regards, it's not sufficient for kids to drive their learning. And that's before you think about first responders, nurses, bus drivers, firemen, policemen, who literally have to go to work. And so we have to rethink what success requirements are in the future, with the future of learning. And just because we know that homes have a computer or have access to broadband, we have to make sure they have enough devices and enough broadband capability to do all of those things simultaneously. 3 kids learning all day long, and 2 adults working from home all day long with enough adequate broadband that they don't crash and that they can use solutions like Dreambox Learning. The world isn't ready for that. And even though we know that 85% of homes have access to devices and broadband, I would argue that the percentage that have persistent and consistent access for fully online learning is much, much lower than that.
So, you're seeing this kind of day in and day out with your work. What are, things that could help bridge that gap or solve that gap in the future? What needs to be done or start to be put into place to kind of make sure that these problems, are solved? What needs to be done there?
So I think there are probably 3 levels that we have to think about. So let's first think about the national policy level. We have to move from where we are now, where your zip code largely determines your access to broadband. And we have to move toward a policy solution where broadband is considered like a utility. So do you have water in the home? Do you have electricity in the home? Do you have broadband in the home? It has to be a leveling agent, and we need national policy to guarantee that every home has access to broadband. That's the first thing. At the state level, we have to make sure that there are incentives in place for districts to have capacity building strategies in the event of a hurricane. It doesn't have to be a pandemic, God forbid it's not going to be another pandemic, but think about fires or hurricanes or extended snow days. We have to have a plan, and I think we should align funding with the existence of a capacity plan for districts to make sure that every district is in a state of readiness, regardless of what calamity might occur. At the local level, we have to make sure that teachers are invested in so that they can be shepherds of online learning and blended learning. And I like to think of teachers as learning engineers because it suggests that they have a different relationship with technology and with data. And we have to make sure that their preparation, both in school and live while they're working, will help them become masters of both the data and the technology that they need in order to make sure that every child, regardless of their condition in life, regardless of the zip code that they happen to live in, has equal access and equal opportunity to learn. So I think all three levels are important: federal policy, state guidelines, and local focus on teacher readiness.
For that last bit, getting teachers to that next level and ready to kind of handle these requirements, how can platforms like Dreambox help them get to that level?
So I mentioned that we opened the platform for free through the end of the school year. We did other things, though. One of the things that we did was we recognized that the relationship between the school-based learning guardian and the home-based learning guardian might indeed be permanently changed. So we added resources to our website so that an older sibling, an aunt, a mom, a father, a home-based learning guardian could understand Dreambox, understand how to use Dreambox, understand how to support their child or their little brother and sister on Dreambox. So we added resources, free resources to our website to help home-based learning guardians manage the technology. In addition to that, we added more courses to our adult professional learning menu. So Dreambox, like other edtech companies, does a lot to support implementation support and adult learning for blended learning. We added more courses that were independent of mathematics and independent of our solution, just to help teachers get used to and to help them feel more supported in using blended learning solutions. And it's our hope that as they learn to use Dreambox better, they'll be more equipped to use other solutions better as well. We're all in this together. We have to figure out a way to help teachers and help parents so that we can all wrap our arms around every child to make sure that they're not disadvantaged because they don't have an equal opportunity to learn.
How do you think, there's been obviously so much change this year, and how do you think it's going to affect, the future, even looking past the pandemic, once it's safe to return to classrooms and stuff? How do you think everything that teachers and parents and students have gone through and learned this year will inform how learning changes in the future?
So I'm very optimistic. I think it's painful that we had to accelerate the move toward new models of learning as a result of a pandemic. But I'm very, very hopeful that we'll never go back to the way things were before. What we are seeing is a permanent acceleration in future learning models that are better for students because they're personalized, they're supported with technology so that technology can do what technology does best, which is mass customization at scale. And it's going to create a level of comfort. Think about how many people understand how to use solutions like Zoom now just because they were forced to learn them. The same applies to education technologies. They were forced to learn them. They went through growing pains in the beginning. And when they come back to school to begin the next school year, it's going to be easier for what they have learned. So I'm very, very hopeful about the future of learning. And I'm very, very hopeful about the adoption of learning technologies in the future, because people are going to see and they're going to know from their own personal experience that they were helpful to them, that they made it easier for them, that they were more successful with that support from EdTech than without it. So even though it was hard to go through the typhoon to learn it, I believe that we're all going to be better off, and kids are going to have more engaging, more personalized, and more effective learning experiences because of what we all had to go through in the wake of COVID-19.
I think we covered a lot. Is there any last thoughts or anything else you'd like to add?
The only thing I would like to add is this. Parents are so worried that their kids are going to suffer because they don't get things perfectly at home while they're guiding their child's learning. They're not professional teachers, they know it. They might not remember how to do calculus or how to explain parabolas because it's been a long time. But this is what I would say to parents. Kids are more resilient than you think they are. And knowing that you are there to support them, even if it feels a little rough, is the best thing that you can do for your child. So I encourage parents to continue, because it's going to still be hard as we manage through this recent surge. But just know that your presence and your support and your encouragement of your child, especially during frustrating moments with EdTech, is going to be the most important gift you can give your child.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Payal and Jessie. For our final session of this event, I'd like to welcome two leaders from Yale University. Dr. Laurie Santos is professor of psychology and head of Silliman College at Yale, and creator of the hugely popular online course, The Science of Well-Being. And Lucas Swineford is executive director of digital education at Yale's Poorvu Center for Teaching and Learning. Thank you both for being here. Lucas, let me start with you. How has Yale's faculty responded to the pressures of the coronavirus pandemic, and what's going on in those online classrooms? What's been easy and what's been hard and challenging?
Yeah, Julia, thank you for having us today. The faculty response has been incredible over the last 8 months. Faculty have shown determination, resiliency, creativity, a willingness to learn themselves and experiment with new forms of pedagogy. And that's all in an effort to really make sure that remote learning for Yale students is as effective as possible. Once the semester closes, we'll have surveys and evaluations to help us identify really more definitively what worked and what worked well and what hasn't. But we're having constant conversations with faculty and students, and I can say that some of the things that are working well are the use of breakout rooms during synchronous live sessions to encourage different forms of peer-based learning. More intentional choices about content that can be delivered asynchronously so that live sessions can be used more for active learning techniques. Some faculty have noticed that more students are attending virtual office hours than office hours that are held in person. Some of the things that are more challenging are ones that we might have expected or did expect going into this. Lab-based courses, typical timed closed book assessments, and figuring out how to replicate those few minutes of unstructured time before and after classes. That's usually reserved for housekeeping or just general chit-chat, but that's important to make that connection between students and students with faculty. That's something we haven't yet figured out.
Thank you. And Laurie, as head of Silliman College, you're with the students. So tell us, how are they doing in this environment? How are they coping?
Yeah, I think the students are coping amazingly well given everything that's so different right now. Yale right now has students living on campus for the most part. Some students are studying remotely, but they're taking pretty much all of their classes online. And this means the classroom experience is really, really different right now. Students are mostly taking Zoom classes from their rooms. And that means they're kind of missing out on the kind of thing Lucas was mentioning, the informal chit chat, right? Getting to know the other students in your classrooms. I think that's a huge difference. But there's also just huge differences in in residential college life. Many of the extracurriculars students are used to are just hard to do in a pandemic. Most of our sports are kind of on hold or running in a really limited fashion. Many of the students' extracurriculars aren't happening. And that means their day is structured in a really different way. I think, residential college life just looks completely different than it did, just last year at this time. And in some ways, I think that that's, striking. I think that, that's a little stressful for students. But what's been amazing, at least on Yale's campus, is that the students have been reacting really, really well to this. They've been able to find friend groups, even in this strange online domain. They've been doing well in their online classes. I think, a lot of people were really worried at the start of the semester of what residential college life would look like. And I think by and large, it's been much more successful than most folks thought.
Thank you. Lucas, you referenced this, that some courses and some parts of teaching work well online, others are more suited for in-person. How do you think this pandemic and the situation that you're dealing with is affecting the way that professors are thinking about designing their courses? Are they really willing to change in the long term? Are there changes that are coming in that type of approach, maybe permanently?
Obviously it's a question that we can't wait to find out the answer to, but I believe it's inevitable that there will be some design changes, and that some of what we're seeing right now at Yale will persist beyond the pandemic. From the faculty participation perspective, I do think, I'm confident faculty are open to making changes. I mean, we had over 500 faculty attend one of our course support workshops this summer, another 200 attend over the fall, and we're expecting 75 to attend a December workshop to help them get prepared for the spring. To me, that level of participation and engagement shows a real willingness to want to try some new teaching practices and experiments. Now, that doesn't mean that Yale College is going to adapt a policy where attending class is optional, once we emerge from this pandemic, or there will not be virtual reality components to every course. But there are likely, and I really hope, going to be some subtle changes. Again, when we talk about things like intentional use of asynchronous content, are there ways that we can incorporate more active learning techniques, even in lecture halls when students are physically present? One practice that a number of faculty have been using this semester, which was always possible, is the use of outside lecturers or guests to speak to their class over Zoom. Now, of course, this has always been possible, but given that we now have thousands of faculty members using tools like Zoom and being comfortable with it, they realize how easy it can be to invite an outside guest into their class. And that opens up a world of possibilities when you no longer require someone to be in New Haven to speak to your class on a particular topic. You can really imagine exposing your students to thinkers and researchers around the world from different perspectives and have them in your class just with an internet connection. So I do believe we will see some changes, hopefully some subtle ones, but hopefully other large ones.
Laurie, you already had a perspective on digital learning based on your experience with your course, The Science of Well-Being. I know that started as an in-person course and was later made an online course available to people beyond Yale. Can you tell us a bit about why you decided to do that, and tell us a bit about what's happened since the pandemic, as I know that it has exploded and become quite a global phenomenon?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, that class started as a live class at Yale. And the reason for teaching this class was because of what I was seeing as a head of college on campus. I was just seeing incredible numbers of students reporting that they were depressed or anxious or just like overall stressed out. And I realized that, this meant that we weren't meeting our mission as educators. These days, nationally, over 40% of college students report being too depressed to function. Over 60% report being overwhelmingly anxious. With these numbers, we're just not meeting our educational mission unless we address some of these mental health issues. And so that was why I decided to teach the live class. I kind of put together everything that I could put together on evidence-based practices for feeling better, evidence-based practices for flourishing. And it was a new class, so I assumed it'd be pretty small. I assumed only, 30 or 40 students would take it. So you can imagine my surprise when we had to get a concert hall to fit all the students who wanted to take the class. Over 1,000 students taking it. It became the largest class ever in Yale's 300-year history. And that meant I got some for the class outside the class. And that was what was really incredible, because once the press for the class started coming out, I started getting emails from people all over the world saying, it's not just Yale students who need this. All of us feel like we need some help in terms of our flourishing. And that was what convinced us that it might make sense to actually put the class online. So We developed a sort of shorter version of the class that we put on Coursera.org. And even in the first months when we posted the class, we had hundreds of thousands of learners sign up, which was really incredible. But what was even more striking was what happened once the pandemic started. I remember colleagues from the Poorvu Center for Teaching and Learning emailing me over the weekend to say, have you noticed what's happening to your class? Because hundreds of thousands of people were signing up every day during the pandemic. We wound up with over 3 million learners. And I think this tells us a couple of things. One is, it tells us that people really want to promote their well-being, right? And it's not just Yale students who are voting with their feet. Everyone really wants to learn better ways that they can deal with their own well-being, that they can deal with their flourishing. And really during the time of the pandemic, people really needed this. But it told me something else, which is that if you put out good quality digital content, people are going to come. People just have a motivation to learn more. And once that content is out there, people will sign up for it. And it's really made me realize that we can reach literally millions of people with the content that we want to share here at Yale. It's just been a fantastic experience. And it's taught me that, digital education really can reach everybody if you put the right content out there.
That's a good segue, actually, to back to you, Lucas, to talk about what's the trajectory of digital education generally. So we know that online degrees, online courses have been available, but has there been the perception that it's an equal opportunity, that the quality will be similar or the same to an in-person experience, and especially when those things are so important for communities that might lack the ability to attend daily or weekly classes in person, like people with children, people with disabilities. How is that changing?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because we've always struggled with this topic about whether online education and online program is less than the residential program. And I would hope that one of the ideas we'll be coming out of this pandemic with, and this forced transition to remote learning, is that it is not less than. It's also not the same as. When we think about a place like Yale, the classes are just one part of the educational experience for the undergraduate students, and the rest of the education are parts that Laurie talked about, the conversations that they have with one another, and not just as they walk between classes, but in the dining halls, in the courtyards. There is a really sort of a magical ingredient to being in residence and on campus for some programs, and certainly we see that at Yale with undergraduates. However, one of the items that we're learning is, as you mentioned, Julia, there have been online degree programs, particularly in professional and master's programs, for quite some time. And at Yale, we're really seeing that you can effectively deliver a professional program using a low or no residency model. So that's really from the program perspective. If you think about the students, particularly learners who, for different reasons, for different life circumstances, really require flexibility. They're unable to commit to leaving their jobs and moving to a different city just to pursue a particular 2-year master's program. They are going to have options. They will demand it. And I think as universities, we'll need to adapt to that. We're already seeing some activity at Yale. The School of Public Health recently announced the creation of an online Master's of Public Health degree, which will launch in July of 2021. And we're building this program to attract qualified professionals who, for one reason or another, would be unable to attend our residential program. Now, it's not going to be the same exact program as the one in residence, but the education, the learning that these students receive will be the same quality. It will be uniquely built for them, same quality, but we can't replicate what we're doing in person online, because quite frankly, there will be some things that we can do online as we think about professional programs for learners who require flexibility that will be better completed in that environment than they may be in residence. And I think the other thing that this switch to emergency remote teaching has done is almost serve as a grand experiment in online education. I mean, we are learning every week more about what practices translate better to the online environment than others. What is the best way to support students, all types of students, in this remote situation? How do we deal with matters of technology, connectivity, and perhaps isolation? We're getting better all of the time. Just thinking of our center, the guidance and advice that we're able to provide faculty today, I believe is better than it was even in June, because we're continually speaking with faculty and students, collecting data and incorporating that feedback into the suggestions that we're making. So whether we're talking about online single courses from places like Coursera or full online degree programs, I do think students are going to have a wealth of choices coming up here to enroll in programs and enroll in courses and continue their education in a manner that meets their particular needs.
That's really interesting. And of course, we do know that while digital access may seem to be a great equalizer, we also know that some students have limitations. They may not have access to reliable Wi-Fi. They may not have a space or quiet places to study and to participate in classroom discussions. Laurie, how has Yale responded to those students that have those issues and those gaps, and how do you think that might change perceptions among students and faculty going forward?
Yeah, I think Yale's done a really great job of this. And I'm so glad you asked this question, because I think this is really a struggle for online learning, right? Online learning means that we can get, incredible content into, every laptop in the country. But there are access issues, right? Some of the students at Yale might not have a high quality laptop. Some of the students at Yale might not have bandwidth from home if they're studying remotely. And some of the students from Yale might not have space to study. I'm hearing from some of my students here, even in Silliman, that they, have 5 brothers and sisters and they live in a 2-bedroom house. How are they going to get, time where they can just kind of focus on their classes? And so Yale's reaction to this has both been to allow remote students to gain access to the financial means to set themselves up well. So get a high quality laptop, purchase broadband so that they're getting high quality internet access, but also to make use of facilities on campus to help students. And so we had a petition process for students who might not have the best setup at home to be able to stay on campus next semester. So originally our first years were supposed to head home to study remotely so that we could de-densify across campus. But if you were any student who really needed access, you were able to stay. And so I think that's something we need to think about. We forget that campus can be this great equalizer, where every student has access to a bedroom and really great Wi-Fi and a library to study in. This is something, as institutions think more about remote education, we really do need to worry about. That said, there is a fantastic thing about remote education that I've noticed, which is that it allows students' families to get a lot more involved in their education. Even the lab meeting class that I'm hosting this semester, sometimes students, mom or dad will kind of come and say hi, and I can meet them really easily. You'll see their pets kind of walking around in the background. It allows for a connection with the whole student in this way that I've really quite enjoyed.
That's nice. That's similar to what's been happening in all of our offices as well, no doubt. Well, I have one last question for each of you, which is what is the change that you would like to see, whether driven by the accelerated innovations from the pandemic or generally, what's the changes that you think are essential for the future of education? Lucas, could you start?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to continue on this theme of students. And this may not be a change for every institution, but what I'd like to see is universal and unrelenting focus on students. Right? Imagine if all course and program design decisions were made with the students at the center. If we made sure that all students had the support they needed in and out of the classroom, wherever their classroom may be, to succeed. If we thought about how we can best prepare students for the world that they're about to enter, if we ensured equitable access for all students, even if we expanded the definition of who we consider a student, if we're able to do this, this would have, in my view, both short-term, but perhaps more importantly, long-term benefits for both the students, the institutions, and not to be too grand about it, but I think the world.
That's great. Laurie, how about you?
I think the one problem with online education that we need to fix, which is how we get those informal interactions back into the classroom, right? I think if I look at my semester, this is what they're missing the most. The quick chit chat with friends, in class, before the professor starts up. The informal interactions that you have, walking with the professor away from class, right? These are the kinds of informal, unstructured interactions that we have a hard time building into kind of online education, but also online interactions generally. This is the kind of thing that companies are talking about. How do we get the water cooler conversations back in a Zoom world? My sense is that we're going to come up with really creative, psychologically inspired solutions for this problem. And I think once we get those, then we'll really be able to bring in the best of residential life, the best of being there
in real person, like in real time, back into online education. And I think once we get that, we'll really be able to bring the whole classroom remote.
That's great. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank you both for taking part in this important discussion, and good luck with the rest of the school year. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you again to all our speakers for these interesting and important conversations around access, equity, and the future of education. I also want to thank our audience for tuning in. You can find additional resources from our speakers in the Resource Center at the bottom of the page. We'll also make the recording of today's event available on YouTube. And remember to share on social media using the event hashtag Future of Education. In just a moment, our survey will pop up on your screen, and we'd love to get your feedback. Again, thank you for joining.